merciful Savior. And in that song, it recounts several different relational titles that we give to God. And so each of these names are ways that we think of God. When you think of God, you think of these different relational titles and the correspondence to us and him and how it works. And let me just give you a few of them. We're familiar with the term Savior. We're familiar with the term Redeemer. We're familiar with the term friend, counselor, comforter, keeper, spirit, father. These are all relational terms that are used in the song and how we think about who God is. And we're all familiar with these terms. This morning, I want to introduce a term to you that you might not think of when you think of God and his relationship to you or your relationship to him. I would venture a guess that this one doesn't come to mind very often at all, maybe never. And that term is partner. See, most of us don't think that we would ever call ourselves God's partner or in partnership with God. In fact, if somebody spoke like that, you might think poor of them, like they thought they were high and mighty to be partner with God. But I want to focus on that term, partner. I want to focus on the term partnership this morning, because partnership is probably the best equivalent to the word covenant. And covenant shows up in the scriptures this morning. God is forming a covenant with Abram, or he's really showing Abram that he's already formed a covenant with him, but he's giving Abram a picture of that covenant in terms that Abram would understand, so that Abram would trust him better. For our terms, it might be, instead of us cutting animals in half like Abram did and then walking through that together with the person that we're making covenant, that was the ancient custom of covenant making, one of them anyway. We'll talk about others. But that's what we see Abram do. We see him split several animals in half and walk through them with the covenant partner, is how it's supposed to work. It's not how it worked here, and we'll explain why later, but that's how it's supposed to work. In our day, if Abram were in our day and God was just making this plan now, Abram would say, God, give me something else, give me something else. And I think God would do something like erect a lawyer firm and invite Abram into the firm, and they'd sit at a table and they'd have papers and they'd have a signing ritual and they'd have this sort of thing. And God would have Abram pass out on the lawyer's table and fall asleep, and God would sign the document. But what you can't escape is the fact that God sees Abram, and Abram is to see God as being in some form of partnership covenant. Let me give you what I think is a good definition of covenant that we get from Tim Mackey and John Collins from the Bible Project. This is what they say. Covenant is a word that describes a formal relationship between two parties who agree to a set of promises so they can work together toward a common goal. Let me read that one more time. Covenant is a word that describes a formal relationship between two parties who agree to a set of promises so they can work together toward a common goal. And what I want to point out to you this morning is that God created the world with having a partnership with mankind in mind. Partnership. What do I mean by that? I mean that God created it all. God created the universe, he created the earth, he created it from the heavens to the earth, so everything in between. It's a merism, high, low, everything in between. He created it all, and he puts man on there, and he commissions man to continue fulfilling his mission, which is to fill the earth and multiply with his image. So the idea is that God created man and woman in his image, and he wants the earth to be filled with that image. We know that because we look at the prophets, and they say there was a day coming where the earth will be covered with the knowledge of God like the water covers the sea. So God wanted this earth to be covered with knowledge of him. And the way he designed to do that is to create people in his image, in his character, to reflect what he's like and spread them all out over the earth so that his image is reflected all around the earth. That was the initial idea, and it never sways from that. That's always the idea. Just like I've referred to ancient kings when they conquered civilizations and they can't be there themselves, they cast an image of themselves or a statue, and they send that statue to that distant location so that everybody knows Artaxerxes is in control of us now because that's his image. That's what he looks like. His presence is here, so we obey him. God wanted that with us. But throwing a term like Artaxerxes on it makes it ugly. It makes it in man. God wanted us to reflect him in his love, his character, his generosity, his kindness, his faithfulness everywhere. And he doesn't abandon that mission. There is a day coming where knowledge of him will cover the earth like waters cover the sea. It's incredible. Think of being in the bottom of the sea and looking up. And that's how much knowledge of God will be around this globe at some point. What does Revelation say? It says that everyone inside the city will have his name on their foreheads. Finally, we will fulfill our mission of being truly in the image of God. And actually, when someone talks to us, they'll be able to get an adequate and accurate look at what the Father is truly like. So that's been the mission from day one. Look at Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, heavens, over every living thing that moves on the ground. This is the idea. But we know that Adam failed to fulfill that mission. Adam ate from the tree, which was to say, God, I'll do it my way. And in that moment, he stopped looking like God. And in that moment, God said, now you must die because you're not fulfilling the mission. You don't look like me anymore. Not in the way that I want you to. We're still in the image of God, but we don't reflect him. I've shared before, it's like John Calvin says, we look at ourselves in a carnival mirror and our head looks this big when it's really only this big or this big. And everything gets distorted. And that's what we're like when we don't reflect God's image the way we ought. But what's good news is that God did not abandon the mission. He did not abandon the goal to fill the earth with his image. And so he makes a promise to Adam and Eve that he will crush the serpent's head. He'll undo everything he did through this mysterious figure called the wounded victor. That's how we understand it. And so God keeps his covenant even though man failed to keep his part of it. God's going to continue to press on to fill the earth with his glory. It's the best thing for us. If you believe something else, you're wrong, and you'll be saddened by what you're pursuing, because only the glory of God will truly satisfy you. One of my frequent prayers is for God to make us happy in his glory. It's kind of hard when we grow up with birthday parties that are about our glory, right? Friends have what's called a birthday week. It's not just a day. It's my week. But God doesn't stop. He's destined to fulfill the mission. So, Adam and Eve drop the ball, and what happens as a result of them dropping the ball? Look at how Genesis 6:5 goes strictly against filling the earth with his glory. Look at this, Genesis 6:5, 11, and 12. God looks down, he's supposed to see his glory exuding from everybody on earth. What does he see instead? The wickedness of man was great in the earth, not his glory. And that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the earth was filled with his glory? No, it was filled with violence. Do you see that God hates the stuff that we hate? We don't like people getting picked on and all this sort of thing. We don't like having to lock our doors. Either does God. We don't like going in airports and going like this and taking off our shoes and getting wanded to see if we strapped a bomb to ourselves. God doesn't like that either. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So instead of seeing his glory, he sees violence, he sees greed, he sees awfulness. So what he does in purposing to fulfill his covenant is he wipes that nastiness out. He wipes that filth out. And he keeps the best version of humanity, the best vestige of humanity, and that person is a man named Noah. He keeps him, he keeps his family. But we find that it's not going to work choosing from humanity itself as he is, because Noah's second act that we find in Genesis is to plant a vineyard and get stone drunk and lie naked in his tent. Just like Adam, eating fruit, drinking fruit, and having his nakedness exposed. In other words, there's no hope in and of humanity itself. So where does Noah's descendants, because it all kind of starts over, the clock starts over now with Noah, and where do Noah's descendants end up? That's where Genesis 11 shows us, and I want you to see how Genesis 11 completely goes against what God told Adam to do in Genesis 1. Look at, they said to one another, this is Noah's descendants, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. It's the exact opposite of what God wanted. They're making a name for themselves instead of giving glory to God in his name, and instead of spreading out over the earth, they're saying, let's stick together. It's the exact opposite of what God wanted. But God is not stopping to fulfill his mission. So what does he do? Well, he promised in the flood that he'd never wipe out humanity again. So he keeps his promise. And instead, he confuses their languages. So instead of wiping them out through the flood, he disperses them through the confusing of their languages, and they get dispersed over the whole face of the earth. So God is keeping his covenant. And then, in place of them making a name for themselves, he chooses, this time he doesn't choose the most righteous person, like Noah. This time he chooses an idol worshiper named Abram. He picks him to be his man. And he says to Abram, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing, and in all the families of the earth, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis 12, 2 and 3. So in Abram's name being great, God's name was the greatness it deserves, because he's taking a pagan, barren, no kids, and he's doing a miraculous thing with him. So in the end, anybody that looks at Abram will say, your God's incredible, because if he can take you and do this, I have nothing else to say, but he's incredible. So, do you see God with Abram redeeming his initial purpose to fill the earth with his glory? Spread it out, you'll bless all the nations of the earth. Do you see how he's redeeming the initial partnership? And it's here where Abram is having a hard time believing how good this news is. How can it possibly be? Is it really going to happen, God? Tell me it's going to happen. Is anything too good for the Lord? Abram's grappling with that thought. And so he's doubting, and he says to God, I don't even have a kid yet. We don't know. It's sometime in 11 years. We don't know at what point. But he says, look, we're going. Have no kids, God. What's the deal? And God reaffirms the promise. Go out and look at the stars. So now Abram has a visual reminder that his descendants will be like the dust and the stars, day and night, up and down. He's surrounded by God's promise. But Abram wants to know further. And God, Genesis 15:7 this morning, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans. And friends, this is supposed to be a great comfort to Abram. He's saying, Abram, you're looking forward. Your eyes are ahead. Your eyes are on tomorrow. Your eyes are on next year. Your eyes are 9 months from now specifically. And what I want you to do for a moment is I want you to turn your head around. I want you to look back. I want you to look back to the Ur of the Chaldeans, where I called you the first time. And I want you to just go on that journey for a while. I want you to go back there, and then I want you to mentally walk into Canaan. I want you to be there for the famine all over again. And I want you to remember how you felt in the famine. So you went to Egypt, and you lost Sarah to Pharaoh. And I want you to experience those nights again. And then I want you to remember how I saved your wife for you, how I loaded you down with possessions, how I took care of you there. I want you to remember how Pharaoh came to you and said, why don't you tell me the truth? I want you to remember how faithful I've been to you. And then you get back in the land, and I've so blessed you that you've got to separate from Lot. Lot gets captured, and then you go, and with 318 men, you overcome 4 powerful kings. I want you to remember all that. Because if I could do that, can't I do this? You see, this is a frequent technique of God throughout the scriptures, that the moment you doubt the present, doubt him in the present, or the moment you doubt him in the future, what God does is he takes you to the past. And he says, look here, look here, look here, look here. You see me there? If you saw me there, you'll see me here. You'll see me now. Just wait on me. And all of us in this room, whether you've trusted in it or not, there's a great act of faithfulness of God in the past, which is for us all to believe in. And it's the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of him from the grave. If God can do that, if he can give up his own son, and he can take that son and raise him from the dead so that we can bear all his inheritance and fruits, why won't he care about right now? So frequently the New Testament looks back to that episode. It's fascinating that these words in Genesis 15, I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of Chaldeans, are almost exact to in Exodus before God gives Israel the 10 Commandments, and he says to them, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. In other words, I'm about to give you 10 commandments, and you're going to wonder if these commandments are for your good or for your ill. It's the big thing. If you ask most people in society, if you start following God, you just stop somebody in the mall or on the street, if you start following God through Jesus Christ right now, do you think your life will get happier or sadder? They'll say sadder. That's why I sin. It gets me happier. But God seeks to undo that lie, and he says to Israel before he gives them the 10 Commandments, listen, I'm going to give you these 10 laws, these 10 rules, and I'm going to tell you, before I give them to you, I'm the guy that just saved you. I've given the illustration before. If you fall in the Mississippi at this time of year, and you're flailing, and before hypothermia sets in this ice-cold, frigid water, a boat pulls up beside you, and a guy gets you and pulls you into the boat. You don't know him from Adam. The first thing he's likely to tell you is, take off your clothes. And your knee-jerk response is going to be like, what? But you listen to him because of what he just did to you or for you. He saved your life. And if this guy saved your life, his next words out of his mouth are probably for your good, just like him pulling you out of the frigid water was for your good. So you listen to him. And this is what God's doing for Israel. He's saying, I'm the one that liberated you. Therefore, trust me in what I'm about to say. Listen to me. And this is what God's doing to Abram. But Abram wants more details. That's not enough for Abram. He says, okay, you're the guy that took me out of the Ur of Chaldeans, but how do I know? How do I know you're going to give me the land? You told me you're going to give me a son. How do I know for sure you're going to give me the land? And this is where it gets interesting. Because we have another reference point, a couple actually, in the scriptures. Do you think God's pleased or displeased with Abram at this point? Abram keeps asking. He sounds a little bit like Gideon to me. It's interesting, when Gabriel comes to Mary in the New Testament and says, you're going to have a baby, Mary says back to him, how am I going to have a baby when I'm a virgin? And Gabriel, without a blink, starts answering her question. But right before that, there's an old guy named Zechariah, and the same angel comes to Zechariah, and he says, hey, Zechariah, you and your wife Elizabeth, you're going to have a son. And Zechariah says something very similar to Mary. He says, how is that possible? Me and Elizabeth are old. And Gabriel says, since you didn't trust the Lord, you will be mute until John the Baptist is born. It's like, what did Zechariah do that Mary didn't do? And the answer is, we don't really know for sure, other than Mary probably had a faith spirit. I believe this, just show me how. Whereas Zechariah's like, whatever, how is this supposed to, that's not going to. We see something similar with Abram and Sarah. Now, later in Genesis, God's going to tell Abram, it's not just going to come from you, it's going to come from you and your wife Sarah. And Abram falls on the ground, belly laughing. Sarah overhears the news later, and she laughs to herself, and God rebukes her. They both laugh. Why is Abraham not chastised and Sarah is? Because Sarah laughed an unhealthy laugh, a skeptical, cynicism sort of laugh, and Abram laughed with tears of joy. It's wonderful. Sarah's tears were probably tears of bitterness, deep sadness, and a hopelessness. But Abram, at least at this point, God keeps answering his questions. And he says, God, how am I supposed to know that there's going to be land in the future? I'm living here, and there's really not much to my name right now. I see all these civilizations around, and they don't think twice about me. What's the deal? And so God condescends to enter into a covenant with Abraham according to the ancient rituals of covenant. Now let me remind you one more time what a covenant is. It'll be on the screen. A covenant is a word that describes a formal relationship between two parties who agree to a set of promises so they can work together toward a common goal. But here's what I want to tell you. While this is how covenants work, most kings, when they entered a covenant with a lesser vassal, they actually themselves would not walk through the two pieces of the animal. And the idea was, the way it was supposed to work is you cut these animals in half, and it's very sobering. You got blood, entrails, guts. It's an awful scene, pools of it, and you walk through this with your partner, and the idea is, look, man, if you mess up your side, this is what you're going to look like. And if I mess up my side, I agree that this is what I should look like. But most kings in the ancient rituals would not go through it with the lesser vassal. They would allow him to go through it and say, essentially, I will establish affiliation with you, but I'm not taking all the responsibility myself, and I'm sure not taking any consequences if this backfires. But I'll associate with you. That's what the kings would do. And here, you have God Almighty coming down and doing at least three things here in this moment, which is absolutely incredible. He's walking through this covenant. He's effectively saying, if I fail on my part, my infiniteness will become finiteness. And I will become finite. I could die. I'm entering in. I'm giving you my oath that I will keep my side. And if I fail, my infinite will become finite. So that's the first unbelievable thing that God does, that he condescends to this place to say to Abram, trust me, Abram, I'm willing to put my life on fulfilling my word with you. So that's the first amazing thing. The second amazing thing is that he puts Abram to sleep. So he walks through it alone, which effectively says, I am going to bear not just some of the responsibility, I am bearing all of the responsibility to get this mission completed. I'm bearing it all. It all rests on my shoulders because you're asleep. That's the second amazing thing. The third amazing thing is that in Abram being asleep, God agrees to take on Abram's consequences if he fails. He effectively says, I'll die if I fail, and I'll die if you fail. And God knows that Abram is going to fail. So God is effectively saying, I will die to fulfill this mission. This is who our God is. This is what he's like. And so Abram prepares the elements. He cuts the beasts. He arranges the birds. And as that happens, birds, these falcons, very likely, when you compare the Hebrew word used there and the rest of the places it's used in the Old Testament, it probably means a carrion-eating falcon comes down and they begin trying to eat the meat, and Abram rushes them off. And it's just kind of a weird sentence. You're like, why did Moses put that in there? What's the significance of that? What's fascinating is that as I studied, the commentaries are uniform in saying that that moment where he's chasing off the birds has symbolic significance. What's fascinating is that as God affirms his promise to Abram and he tells them, you're going to inherit the land, but before you inherit the land, your descendants will spend 400 years in slavery to another nation. You need to know that. That's part of it. God's laying it out. So don't be surprised when that 400 years comes. It's part of the package. What's interesting about that is that they'll spend 400 years in Egypt, and one of Egypt's prime gods, Horus, is illustrated by a carrion-eating falcon, and the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, associated himself with the god Horus. And so, Abram chasing off these falcons was very likely symbolic of the time that Israel is going to be in fear and frustrated and worried and struggling. Just pictured as Abram chasing these off. This isn't working. I don't like this. This isn't the way it's supposed to go. And that's going to be typified in Israel's 400 years in slavery to Egypt. Very interesting, if commentators are right in understanding that symbolism. So, God does this. And then he puts Abram to sleep. And I just want you to imagine that moment. Think about Abram. Think about it from his perspective. He just did all the hard work. Imagine, in our day, you got to go to the lawyers. You got to get all the paperwork. You got to go to the bank. You got to do this. You got to make this arrangement. You got to do all these things to finally get to the table where you can sign on your house or whatever it is and finally get it all. But you're doing all the legwork for it. Abram was doing all the legwork. He was getting ready to enter, lock arms with God, and walk through. And right after he gets it all ready, his head starts getting heavy. He starts getting tired. And he's thinking, I'm part of this. I'm supposed to be part of this. What's happening to me? Yesterday, we're trying to get Essie down for her nap. And if Becky goes in there, it's hopeless because of the tight relationship they have. And so the kind of bad guy has to go in because she doesn't care as much about me as she does about Becky. And so I get in there and I'm leaning on her pack and play, and I'm patting her back, and I'm just rubbing her face, and her eyes will drop, and they open up, and then they drop. And I finally get it to where they stay dropped. And I start getting up, and the packing plate creaks, and her eyes keep patting. Packing plate creaks again. And I'm going through this process. And I just want you to imagine Abram just looking at this prospect and saying, I'm supposed to be in this. What's happening? Why am I so tired? And he's falling asleep. And likely in his sleep, God gives him this vision of this fiery pot passing through. God frequently throughout the scriptures is seen as a consuming fire. And he passes through, and Abram sleeps during the process. I've said before in Genesis, God's greatest acts are done while his people are asleep. Adam gets Eve while he's fast asleep. Abram gets this covenant reaffirmation when he's fast asleep. Jacob gets his covenant affirmation when he's fast asleep. And I think there's a significance to that. I think there's a point. I think God's saying, the only good that can come in the world will only come from me. It can't come from you. It can only come from me. I'm the source of good. So stop looking at yourself as a worthy partner with me. I am the only good there is. I want to try to illustrate this for a moment. It's something that's going on in our culture right now. There is a racial reckoning that's happening in many cities across the country. What I mean by this racial reckoning movement is you've got city councils sitting on boards, committees, deciding if certain statues or memorials or building names on college campuses should be renamed. And the reason they're going through that is because those names, those statues, those memorials are all associated with the grievous place in our culture several years ago where there was an unjust slavery taking place in America. And these men and these names and these statues and these memorials were participants in that grievous reality in American history. And so cities are reckoning with what do we do with this terrible action associated with these men. How do we handle it? But it's a racial reckoning movement, and statues are falling, and names are being taken off, and buildings are getting renamed, and this sort of thing is happening. And that's one reckoning movement that's happening in our culture. A second movement that's taking place in our culture is a sexual reckoning. It's known as the Me Too movement. And what's happening in this Me Too movement is people, largely women, are outing men for misuse of their status, power, and position to take advantage of them sexually. And so, in these two movements, there is a reckoning taking place. Now, I don't know where you stand on things and where you're at with things, but we all should be very sympathetic with both of these movements. They require different decisions and how to go about things and that sort of thing. And on that, on protocol and how it works out, people may stand on different sides, but we all, as a collective nation, should mourn both and sympathize with both movements entirely. But what I want to say this morning is this. Why stop? Why stop with just these two movements? Why don't we start a movement against liars? And let's start all outing those who lied against us, lied to us, misrepresented the truth, and have everybody start talking about liars too. What about gluttons? What about gossipers? Why don't we all start doing that too? Why don't we start outing every time somebody gossiped to us? What about pornography, lust? Start outing and Pornographic sites start outing names out of their black books of who subscribed and who watched and who visited. All these things. Why don't we do adultery? Why don't we do it all? Put it all out there. So everybody can see everybody's stuff. And here's what you'd find. You'd find all of our names on several movements. You'd find all of everybody's names on several movements. And you would do that and do that and do that until all humanity is thoroughly outed for who we are. But you would find one human being that's standing, and his name would not be on one single list. And that man would be Jesus Christ. And he would stand unvarnished by any ounce of sin. And that's why Abram had to go to sleep, because he was condemnable. Just like we would have to go to sleep, because we're condemnable. We would find our names on too many lists that we'd like to count. But Jesus wouldn't. This is the beauty of what David says in Psalm 32. He says, "Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity." This, David's sin, our sin, got counted to the spotless Lamb, Jesus Christ. He bore those iniquities on the cross. The prophet Isaiah says that he would be cut off in order to pay for all the movements of God against humanity. Ian Guide writes, and he says this, on the cross, the covenant curse fell completely on Jesus, so that the guilty ones who placed their trust in him might experience the blessings of the covenant. Jesus bore the punishment for our sins so that God might be our God and we might be his people. You see, this is the fourth benefit of Abram and God in this covenant that Abram experienced. Not only did he not bear the responsibility, not only did he not bear the consequence, he got all the benefits. He got all the rewards from the covenant by not doing it himself and not bearing the consequences himself. And that is all as a result of Jesus Christ. Amen? This is, the New Testament writes that Jesus, through Jesus, God fulfills his mission to spread his name far and wide, because Jesus came in the exact name of the Father. He looked just like the Father. He had the fingerprint of the Father. If it was cast, if the Father's face were to be cast on a coin, it would be the face of Jesus. So Jesus came as the exact imprint of him, and he saved us. He puts a call out to humanity, and as we trust in him, he begins the transformation process of turning us from one degree of glory to the next into the image of Jesus, into the image of the Father, so that God's initiative from creation can be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. This is the idea. This is how Paul can say in Galatians 3:9, "So then, those who are of faith, those who are laying down helpless asleep, who simply put their trust in God's redeeming work through Christ, are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith." He simply looked to God to fulfill all that he said to do, and he was counted as righteous. Righteousness was assigned to his faith. So, the mission is being fulfilled through Christ. He turns us into his image, and then he tells us to go out into what? All the world. Fill the world with this image that I'm transforming you into. And so, friend, I want to ask you this morning, are you experiencing God transforming you into the image of his Son? Are you experiencing that? Are you experiencing his grace? Are you seeing that on a daily basis? When pain enters your life, do you see that as God's redeeming instruments to craft you and form you into the image of his Son? Or do you see that as an intrusion to your life? You see, we see people who wrong us as an intrusion into our peace. But what God's seeking to do through people wronging us is to establish our peace. And how do we establish our peace? We forgive them. How do we forgive them? We visit the cross and experience Christ's forgiveness of us and say, oh, this is what it looks like to forgive someone that doesn't deserve it. I'm going to forgive them. And as you forgive them, you shine with the glory of Jesus, who was on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, pain, as much as we'd want to avoid someone wronging us, gives us an opportunity to be formed in the image of Jesus. And as you experience that image forming, you will experience freedom like you've never tasted it before. And you will have joy. You lose possessions. That's an intrusion to your life. But as you lose possessions, you'll become more familiar with Deuteronomy 8:3, where God says, I brought you through the wilderness so that you could see that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And as you do that, you will have peace that you've never had before. So friends, I'm going to ask the musicians to come, and I want to ask you, are you experiencing this daily transformation out of your junk into the image of Jesus?